So when does it make sense to decommission a dam? When the downsides outweigh the benefits. This may seem like a cut and dry answer, but how we measure those benefits and downsides is the controversy. This is a picture of Glines Canyon Dam on the Elwha River on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. And it, along with its downstream cousin, was torn down more than a decade ago. These dams were constructed before World War I to generate hydropower for a logging operation. That sawmill shut down decades ago, and the dam eventually changed hands until it was eventually owned by the federal government, which spent 20 years figuring out exactly how to decommission these old structures. This pair of dams was completely blocking all anadromous fish passage to a major area of Olympic National Park. That's a pretty big downside. And in exchange, the dams generated a small bit of hydropower. Now, if you go back 100 years, the power generated by the Elwha dams was a game-changing amount of electricity for this region. We haven't always had a nationwide electrical grid. And a century ago, every community had to have local power production in order to keep the lights on. That was certainly no longer the case for the people of the Olympic Peninsula. And so in 2011, when these two dams were decommissioned, not a lot of people missed them. There's definitely some pros and cons here, but it's generally understood that these dams were causing more damage than benefits for the region. Now let's move south out of Washington and into Northern California on the Klamath River. 3 dams on the Klamath were just removed last year, and the cost-benefit balance on that river is very different. For one thing, these dams actually did produce a significant amount of hydropower for the region, but that came at the cost of blocking all salmon migration on this stretch of the river. Now, you could make the argument that the best habitat for salmon spawning was actually downstream of this site. And let's not forget that there are still dams standing in the way of salmon reaching Upper Klamath Lake, something that isn't likely to change anytime soon. But that doesn't change the fact that these dams on the Klamath River were aging and getting close to the end of their lifespan. Not all of them, but 2 of the 3. But the bigger issue that led to the removal of the Klamath dams was water quality. Klamath Lake, and by extension the Klamath River, is naturally eutrophic, meaning that it's low in oxygen and high in nutrients, which tends to breed algae blooms. So you start with a naturally eutrophic water source in Klamath Lake, combine that with a ton of agricultural runoff from the Klamath Falls area, and then send that water downhill where it warms up in the sun behind these 3 dams. And you've got a recipe for ecological disaster. The 3 dams on the Middle Klamath exacerbated an already difficult environmental situation. And as a result, we saw high levels of toxins in the water and unacceptable temperatures, contributing to several significant fish kills on the Klamath, specifically in 2002 and in 2015. Now, you could make the case that the bigger reason for these fish kills is climate-induced drought. And as we all know, one of our best tools for fighting climate change is to generate energy not from fossil fuels, but from falling water. And so that was a tough call. Do you trade away climate-friendly hydropower in order to save water quality for a species of fish? In the end, the decision was made to decommission these dams. Time will tell whether this was the right decision. Personally, I'm kind of on the fence. But the good news is that the migrating adult salmon naturally moved into the areas behind the dam sites almost immediately. It's hardwired in their brains to do this. It's a very natural thing, and it's awesome. But now let's move on to the next big dam removal project that everyone's talking about, the Lower Snake River. Activist groups like American Rivers have vowed that the Lower Snake River is their next target, saying that it's no longer a question of if, but when. This is quite the assumption to make because these dams in the Snake River share almost nothing in common with the Klamath or the Elwha. For one thing, these 4 dams do not block salmon migration. They have some of the best upstream and downstream migration numbers in the entire world. Trout Unlimited claims on their website that we have the worst salmon and steelhead numbers in 200 years. I mean, this is just clearly false. This is a spreadsheet showing every fish that passed through Ice Harbor Dam since it was constructed in 1962. And the data shows a very complex ecosystem with ups and downs and natural variations that have no correlation to when dams were constructed. If anything, there's far more fish in the river now than there were 50 years ago. You see, only focusing on the dams ignores the 2 biggest factors of how a fish spends its lifespan: the 4 years they spend in the ocean and the habitat where they begin and end their lives to spawn. Upstream of these dams in Washington, there's a ton of mountain habitat in the state of Idaho that used to be prime spawning grounds. Unfortunately, a lot of this habitat was destroyed in the first half of the 20th century, and a significant portion of it is blocked by dams with no fish passage. But they're not blocked by the dams that the activists want removed. And so this takes us back to the original conversation about positives versus negatives. These dams provide an enormous amount of climate-friendly energy, facilitate a transportation system that is keeping millions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and help supply irrigation water to an enormous amount of ground in central Washington. On the other hand, if you were to demolish these dams, you might maybe see a single-digit improvement in year-over-year fish returns. Maybe. It would not be a game changer for salmon habitat or fish passage. The data shows that conclusively. There's one more piece of this conversation that I can't leave out. There's big dams like these that have enormous impact, but there are thousands more small, insignificant dams all over the country that do just as much damage to the ecology. Remember, to a salmon, a 10-foot tall impassable dam is the same as a 1,000-foot tall impassable dam. And many of these small low-head dams were built a century ago for industries that no longer exist. For example, Enlow Dam in north central Washington blocks access to over 350 miles of salmon habitat. It's been abandoned by its owners for decades. Why aren't we focusing on decommissioning dams like this instead of the structures that benefit you and I every single day? So what do you think? Do the downsides outweigh the benefits of the lower Snake River dams?